are going to look at the big picture and put some things in perspective and context of how the nervous system works and gets signals back and forth between your brain and body parts. So we're going to look at two sides here. We have sensory, which is going to be information to your CNS. And we have motor, which is commands from your CNS. And we're going to go through this scenario. We're going to use this example of this woman touches a hot pan. She feels that she touches the hot pan, and then she contracts her muscle to pull her hand away from it. With the sensory, it takes 3 neurons to get this message from her finger to the brain. The first neuron has a different structure than what we learned in chapter 12. That primary sensory neuron is a unipolar neuron. So a unipolar neuron it has dendrites. And the dendrites act as the sensory receptor. Then it has an axon. So you go straight from dendrites to axon. Then you have a little process here, and then your cell body. And then the axon continues, and then here's the part with the knobs that secrete neurotransmitter. So this is the structure that we're dealing with for our first sensory neuron. Dendrites straight to axon with the cell body off to the side, and then the knobs that secrete neurotransmitter. So our 3 neurons are primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary one starts here in her finger. So right here in her finger are going to be those dendrites that act as the receptor. They're going to have gates that open in response to that feeling of heat, and that lets the sodium in and starts the action potential. Then the action potential travels up the axon. So this is the axon. It comes all the way up here to her spine. So remember, axons can be very long. So we have our primary sensory neuron has the dendrites, feel the heat. They open their sodium gates, and these are going to be called modality gates because they opened in response to a sense. They start an action potential on an axon, and that goes to the spine. So if we look in detail here, here's that axon coming in. Right here is the cell body. And remember, this is the posterior root, and the cell body is in that posterior root ganglion. So remember, sensory goes to posterior. So this is the posterior root ganglion where the cell body is. Then we go into the posterior root, into the spine, and we go to the posterior horn of the spine. So when it gets to the spine, it goes through the posterior root, with the cell body in the posterior root ganglion. So this right here, this cell body, is what would be in that ganglion of the posterior root. And then it enters and it has its knobs in the posterior horn of the spine. And these knobs are now going to secrete neurotransmitter. So now we're ready for our next neuron, which is the tertiary neuron. The secondary neuron. So the secondary neuron starts right here. It's receiving that neurotransmitter, and it goes up, and we cross over. Remember, the right and left cross over, so the right side of the brain is connected to the left side of the body and vice versa. And we go to the thalamus. So right here, you have your cell body. It's receiving that neurotransmitter, starting an action potential, and you go up to the thalamus of the brain. Remember, the thalamus is where your incoming sensory information comes into. So up here in this picture, let's see, our other one went through. So here is, we're back to that primary. We're going to finish the primary in this picture. Here's the cell body in the posterior root ganglion. We go into the posterior root, into the posterior horn of the spine. Now here is our secondary. Its cell body is receiving neurotransmitter in the posterior root. Its axon goes up, it crosses over to the other side, and it goes to the thalamus. So our secondary, the cell body receives neurotransmitter in the posterior horn of the spine. Then the axon goes up the spine. It crosses to the thalamus on the other side. And now its knobs will secrete neurotransmitter. So now we're ready for the third neuron. So this is the tertiary. Its cell body is in the thalamus, and it goes up here to the cerebral cortex. And here we can see it in this picture. There's its cell body in the thalamus, its axon comes up, and it goes up there to the cerebral cortex. So the tertiary receives neurotransmitter in the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus decides what to ignore and what to pay attention to. Only things that it decides to pay attention to will continue on up to the cerebral cortex. So most signals don't make it past the thalamus. You can't pay attention to everything. Okay, now see how much you remember from chapter 13. This is touch. So which lobe and which part of that lobe do you think it's going to on the cerebral cortex? Think about touch. So this case, it's going to the parietal lobe and the somatosensory cortex, since she's touching something. And once the signal gets there to her somatosensory cortex on the parietal lobe, that is when she becomes consciously aware that she is touching that hot pan. Okay, now that she knows, she's going to contract her muscle. So we have the biceps here in her arm. She has to send a signal there to make that muscle contract and pull her hand away. So now we're ready to look at the motor side. The motor side has two neurons. The first one is called the upper motor neuron. Its cell body is here in the cerebral cortex, and it comes down. You're going to cross over, remember. You're going to go to the anterior horn of the spine. We can look at it in this picture also. Here's the cell body in the cerebral cortex. The axon crosses over. We come down here to the anterior horn of the spine. And again, think about what you learned about the brain. This would be the motor cortex on the frontal lobe. So when you make a decision to move a muscle, that begins with the upper motor neuron. Its cell body is in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. And then the axon crosses over and then goes to the anterior horn of the spine. And now it's going to secrete neurotransmitter. So now we're ready for the lower motor neuron. So right here is the cell body, and then the axon goes out through the anterior root to the spinal nerve, and it would go out to the body part. So we can follow it up here. There's the cell body in the anterior horn. We go through the anterior root, and then this axon goes all the way down here to the muscle. And then this is where it's going to secrete acetylcholine to make that muscle contract. So the lower motor neuron has a cell body in the anterior horn of the spine. It receives neurotransmitter from the upper motor neuron. Then its axon goes through the anterior root out to the spinal nerve, and then secretes acetylcholine onto the muscle, and that makes the muscle contract. So there's an overview of your neurons. So it takes 3 sensory neurons to get the signal up to the brain. It takes 2 motor neurons to get the information out to the muscle. Another thing we can talk about here is IPSPs and EPSPs. So you remember those from chapter 12. Right here in the spine, where the upper and lower motor neurons communicate with each other, is where you have IPSP and EPSP. So whenever your brain wants the muscle to relax, the upper motor neuron secretes inhibitory neurotransmitter. And this will open the potassium or chloride gates. So that you reduce the voltage and you prevent an action potential in the lower motor neuron. So if there's no action potential in the lower motor neuron, then there is no acetylcholine on the muscle. And without that acetylcholine, the muscle stays relaxed. Then when your brain wants your muscle to contract, it has the upper motor neuron secrete excitatory neurotransmitter. This opens the sodium gates on the lower motor neuron. So then it has an action potential, and it does secrete acetylcholine onto the muscle. And the acetylcholine makes the muscle contract. So an upper motor neuron is always secreting neurotransmitter onto a lower motor neuron. So you have your upper, starts in the brain, it comes down, and then you have your lower, located in the spine, and it goes out, and then you would have your muscle here. Anytime that this is inhibitory neurotransmitter, then there is no action potential here, no acetylcholine here. So the muscle is relaxed. If you do have neurotransmitter here, excitatory neurotransmitter here, then you do have an action potential. You do have acetylcholine, and you contract. So whether or not you get acetylcholine and contraction depends on which neurotransmitter you're secreting onto that lower motor neuron. Now, your brain coordinates activities between your antagonistic muscles. So remember, you learned that muscles come in antagonistic. For example, your triceps and biceps. Your biceps does flexion, your triceps does extension. They do the opposite of each other. So they move the same body part in opposite directions or opposite motions. Your brain coordinates this so that your muscles don't get in a fight with each other over your body parts. So for example, when your brain is telling your biceps to flex and pull your forearm up, it's purposely sending IPSP to your triceps. So if we do another scenario here, if you have your biceps here and your triceps here, they are antagonistic. So they each have their lower motor neuron. And they each have their upper motor neuron. If you're doing flexion, then you have EPSP here. So you would have IPSP here. And then when you're doing extension, it would reverse. So your brain coordinates so that these two muscles don't have EPSP. I'm sorry, the muscle wouldn't have it, but so you're not sending EPSP to both of these effectors at the same time. I'm going through all this because there's a disease in which you lose that control. So you've probably heard of tetanus because hopefully you had your tetanus shot when you were a kid, but you might not know much about tetanus. Usually when I ask people about tetanus and say, what do you know about it? The first thing that comes to mind is rusty nails. Now, this is partially true and partially a myth. There's nothing about rust that is associated with tetanus. So the rust part is the myth. The nails part is kind of true because if you step on a nail, you get a puncture wound. And you tend to get tetanus from puncture wounds. Tetanus is your highest risk of getting tetanus from a puncture wound. So a little about tetanus. Tetanus is caused by a bacteria. It's called Clostridium tetani. This is an anaerobic bacteria. So it means that it only lives where there's no oxygen. And this might be surprising, but there's actually a good chance there's tetanus in you right now. It lives in your intestines. There's no oxygen in intestines. So it lives in animal intestines. And not just humans, all kinds of animals, and especially horses. Horses carry a lot of Clostridium tetani. So it lives just fine in the intestines where there's no oxygen, and it makes endospores. So an endospore is a tough, resistant form of the bacteria. And these endospores are in the feces. And then because animals poop outside on the ground, those endospores get in the soil. So basically, there are tetanus spores in the soil. If you get a puncture wound, and those spores get in it. So like one of the riskiest things you could do to get tetanus would be to be in a place where there's horse manure and get a puncture wound. That's your highest chance of tetanus, is a puncture wound near horse manure. There's no oxygen in a puncture wound. So like a scratch is less risk of tetanus because there's oxygen there. But in a puncture wound, there's no oxygen. And so those spores start to grow into bacteria. And these bacteria produce a toxin. And this toxin goes into your spine and goes to the anterior horn where your motor neurons communicate. Okay, so right here, we have your upper motor neuron and your lower motor neuron. And remember, this is where you have IPSP or EPSP. Well, if you have tetanus, tetanus turns off all of your IPSPs and it makes all of these synapses have EPSP. So this toxin from the tetanus will make all of the synapses between your upper and lower motor neurons have EPSP. So this thing up here where I said antagonistic muscles can't both have EPSP at the same time, your brain won't let them fight. Well, if you have tetanus, they're both EPSP. And both of these muscles contract. So then they do get in a fight with your body parts. So here's a picture of a man who has tetanus. That's what it looks like if every muscle in your body contracts at the same time. And this is called rigid paralysis. So he's paralyzed, he can't move, his body is stuck like that. And he's stuck like that because every single muscle is contracted. Tetanus is also sometimes called lockjaw because it starts in the jaw usually. And the jaw will close and it can't open because the muscles that close your jaw are stronger than the muscles that open it. And when those two muscles get in a fight over your jaw, the ones that close it win because they're stronger. So because you have all of these synapses EPSP, every muscle contracts. Causing rigid paralysis. And the contractions can be so violent that you can actually break your own bones. So today, the good news is there is medical treatment if you get tetanus. It's not easy to treat. You might still spend a few months in the hospital. There's still a chance you could die from it, but it is possible to try and save you. In the old days, before medical treatment, not everyone who got tetanus died of it. It's always possible to survive, but a lot of people who got it died of it. And the only thing they could do for you was they would dig a pit and bury you with just your head sticking up out of the pit. And the reason for that was to try to stop those violent contractions that would end up breaking your own bones. Because if you're buried, you can't really move. So there is your motor neurons and sensory neurons and kind of the big picture of how all that works.